Every murder has a motive: revenge, greed, jealousy. But what if someone killed for a reason far more disturbing? What if the only motive was curiosity? In 2023, South Korea was shaken by a case that left investigators and psychologists searching for answers. A young woman with no violent criminal history carefully planned the murder of a complete stranger. Not because she knew the victim, not because she wanted money, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to kill. This is the chilling story of Jung Yoo-jung, a case that blurs the line between obsession, fantasy, and reality. Welcome to the Grim Archive.
At 3 a.m. on May 27, 2023, a taxi driver in Busan picked up a young woman carrying a large, rolling suitcase. When he offered to help her with the luggage, she insisted on loading it into the trunk herself, despite the suitcase appearing unusually heavy for her small frame. Her destination wasn't a travel hub or a hotel, but a dark, grassy park along the Nakdong River. The driver watched her drag the heavy bag into the field, a strange choice for a passenger at that hour. CCTV footage from that night captures her walking with a rhythmic, almost buoyant energy. She looks like a student on her way to a weekend trip, skipping casually as she pulls a suitcase that, only moments before, contained the dismembered remains of another woman. The cargo was the body of an English tutor she had murdered hours earlier. She had spent the night in the victim's apartment, dismembering her and packing the remains into that bag to be abandoned in the park. When she returned to the taxi 20 minutes later, a driver noticed the suitcase was now significantly lighter. He trusted his intuition and called the police. Within 5 hours, she was in custody. Upon her arrest, the precision of the crime led police to assume they were dealing with an experienced killer or someone with professional help. They immediately performed a forensic dive into her phone to find her network. The forensics revealed a chilling digital void. This diagram represents her device. It contained not a single contact, no outgoing messages, and no social media interactions. For a 23-year-old living in one of the most hyper-connected countries on Earth, this level of isolation is nearly impossible. She had existed for years with no digital footprint and no human connection. This left investigators with a disturbing question. How does someone who is completely invisible to society plan and execute a murder this brazen? Her preparation was meticulous. To appear non-threatening, she purchased a middle school uniform from a thrift store, disguising herself as a young student before heading to her victim's home. She found her target on a tutoring app, posing as a parent seeking an English teacher. She specifically sought out a successful, high-achieving university student, someone whose life was the polar opposite of her own. Once inside the apartment, she violently attacked. The autopsy later revealed over 20 stab wounds, concentrated with a level of precision that suggested she had researched lethal anatomy before ever picking up a knife. This photograph shows the grassy banks of the Nakdong River, where she abandoned the remains. Forensic experts later noted that the moisture and tall grass in this environment are conditions that significantly accelerate decomposition, suggesting the location was chosen to hide the evidence. In custody, her calculated demeanor shifted into a series of transparent lies. She claimed the remains belonged to a baby she had killed, and then feigned stomach pain to derail the entire interrogation. Eventually, she abandoned the excuses. She confessed to the police that she had no motive and no grudge against the victim. She simply wanted to know what killing felt like. The path to that moment began years earlier. Raised by her grandfather, she chose to be invisible to her peers. Classmates recalled she would sit behind curtains alone, refusing to speak, wave, or even acknowledge that anyone else was in the room. After high school, her isolation became absolute. For 5 years, she lived entirely within her bedroom, using the excuse of studying for civil service exams to avoid the outside world. This extreme social withdrawal, often called hikikomori, can have a profound impact on cognitive health. Years without human interaction can degrade the brain's ability to process empathy or understand social consequences. In this vacuum, she filled her time with a relentless consumption of true crime documentaries, watching case after case in total solitude. Her digital records showed that while watching this content, Her interest centered on the mechanics of the crimes and the internal experiences of the killers. This obsession eventually moved from curiosity to a stated desire to replicate the act herself. By the time she stepped out of her room in May 2023, the combination of total isolation and a violent media diet had transformed a reclusive girl into a predator who viewed human life with total indifference. Following her confession, psychiatrists used the Hare psychopathy checklist to evaluate her mental state and determine the risk she posed to the public. The scale goes up to 40. A typical person's score is around a 5, while 25 is the threshold for a clinical diagnosis of psychopathy. Jung Yoo-jung scored a 28. To put that in perspective, notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy scored a 27. She ranked higher on the psychopathy scale than some of history's most prolific killers, despite being caught during what experts believe was only the beginning of a violent cycle. The most disturbing aspect of this case, her pathology wasn't sparked by a sudden trauma. It was cultivated slowly, in the silence of an unnoticed life. Given her clinical score and the lack of remorse she showed in jail, investigators are certain that if she hadn't been caught that night, she would have struck again. The progression was halted by the intuition of the taxi driver who noticed the suitcase was too light. By acting on his gut feeling and calling the police, he brought an immediate end to her spree and forced a person who had spent years hiding from the world to finally face the consequences of it.